Don't move. Hands up. Who do you think you are? Driving around this neighborhood, you broke-ass black bastard? The scream from Officer Ryan Caldwell, a man who calls himself a protector of the law, shattered the quiet morning in Westmont Heights, a wealthy, all-white suburb. His gun barrel pointed straight at a man who neither resisted nor shouted back, only slowly turned his head, Justice Elijah Freeman, 73 years old. But to Caldwell, he was nothing more than a suspicious old black man behind the wheel of an old Cadillac. Justice Freeman, a former Supreme Court Justice of the United States, is a towering symbol of justice, and when the camera was turned off, so was the truth. Elijah was dragged from his car, beaten, detained, and framed by the same rotten police system that uses violence as a tool of control. This story, in real life, could be even harsher than you think. What state are you in? Has anything like this ever happened where you live? The 1965 Cadillac DeVille rolled slowly through Oakwood Heights, its body black as marble, chrome trim catching the glint of the autumn sun. At the wheel was Elijah Freeman, 73, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. His hands gripped the worn leather steering wheel, eyes forward, back as straight as it had been 4 decades ago in federal court. The narrow asphalt road was lined with trees dropping golden leaves like a rug, the scent of decaying wood and faint pine riding the breeze. His son Michael had just moved here with his family, for the school's among the best in the state. Elijah had voiced a mild objection. Michael shrugged it off. "I'm not choosing neighbors, I'm choosing education for the kids." Elijah let it go, but each visit stirred old instincts of nostalgia, but alertness, the kind of all black Americans learn from the first suspicious glance. He had just come from the cemetery, leaving white flowers on his wife's grave, 4 years gone. She'd once told him, "Never let me see you bow your head unless it's to lift someone up." He lived by that. But there are bows invisible to all but the seasoned. At the Maple and Birchwood intersection, he stopped at the red light, his face calm, but his right hand tensed slightly on the wheel as he spotted the patrol car, partly hidden behind Poplar's license plate 6127, familiar from a racial bias case 2 years ago. He checked the mirror. At first, only the hood, then red and blue lights. No siren, no voice, just flashing lights. Unspoken command. Elijah signaled, turned right, eased to the curb, turned on the hazards, cut the engine, lowered the window slightly and placed the flat on the wheel. Movement slow, precise, just as he'd written in a 1992 book on police stops. But no amount of experience could calm his heart, especially as 3 minutes passed, and the officer still hadn't emerged. In the rear view, he saw the man watching. No clipboard, no dispatch call, just watching. It was as if Elijah were running through an invisible filter. Color, skin color, hair color, and the authority the officer believed belonged only to people like him. At last, the car door opened. The officer stepped out, hat low, vest tight, hand resting on the holster, not drawn, but ready. Elijah stared into the mirror, eyes steady but not defiant. He inhaled slowly, voice calm. He didn't need prophecy to know. This drive home wouldn't be simple. A knock on the window. 3 dry taps. Elijah lowered the glass just enough. A polite nod, a civil smile, not warm, not cold, just appropriate for a man who'd argued in federal courtrooms for decades. "Good evening, officer," he said, calm and clear. The officer didn't reply, just stared. No name, no questions, just an uneasy silence thick with warning. "Is this your car?" the officer, Caldwell, finally asked. Not with curiosity, but as if awaiting a confession. Elijah nodded, slowly retrieving his wallet, offering his license through the gap. "How can I help you, officer?" Caldwell didn't take it. He looked, then scanned the dashboard, the gear shift, the leather trim like a check. More like an audit of what doesn't belong. "Help me figure out why a 65 Cadillac's cruising through this neighborhood," Caldwell said, joking, half warning. Elijah knew the tone well. How suspicion wears a casual face but hides a blade. A part of him wanted to stay quiet, nod and survive like so many before, but he was too old for quiet compliance. "I'm Elijah Freeman," he said. "Associate Justice, U.S. Supreme Court. On my way to my son's house at the end of Birchwood." There was a pause. The breeze stirred his silver hair. Caldwell's eyes narrowed from light, but from doubt. "Oh?" he said, smirking. "So what? You're the president too?" Elijah didn't flinch. He pulled a silver-edged federal ID from his embossed pocket and held it out. Caldwell glanced at it. Just a glance. No name read, no serial checked, no database queried. Just a look, like it was a misprinted flyer. Then, "Well, ain't that something? Impersonating a federal official is a serious crime, old man." Each word landed like a sentence passed by someone without the title to judge. Elijah remained composed, but his pulse quickened. This officer wasn't checking facts. He wasn't here for the truth. He only needed a reason to impose power, and Elijah had handed him the perfect one. A black man, alone, in a luxury car, in a white neighborhood, claiming to be a justice. Wrong address, right color. In the mirror, Elijah saw Caldwell's hand leave the ID and settle on the grip of his gun. Caldwell glanced at the federal ID Elijah presented, but didn't take it or examine it closely. His eyes skimmed over the card as if it were a poorly printed business card, then immediately returned to fix on Elijah's face, barely hiding the contempt. "Step out of the car," he said flatly, as if he'd made up his mind the moment he saw Elijah. Elijah kept his voice calm. "May I ask the reason for the stop, officer?" Caldwell raised an eyebrow, voice taut. "Suspicious behavior, you know? An old Cadillac? Outdated registration, showing up in this neighborhood at this hour? Not something you see every day, so my presence is considered suspicious?" Elijah replied, voice low and steady. "I just visited Arlington Cemetery, then went to my son's home, 418 Birchwood, 4 blocks from here." "Oh, since when does an old man in a vintage car wander into this neighborhood acting like he belongs here?" Caldwell tilted his head, tone glacial. "Didn't you hear me? Out of the car." Elijah tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly, but didn't move. "I've violated no traffic laws, and unless you have a specific cause, ordering me out without a warrant is unlawful. I'm a Supreme Court justice. I know the law." That final line wasn't meant to assert dominance, was a warning, a reminder that he wasn't an easy mark. But Caldwell laughed. A short and cutting sound, not processing but rejecting. "Impersonating a federal officer?" he sneered, leaning close to the window. "That's an old trick. Think you can fool me with that shiny silver card?" Elijah's eyes stayed locked. The way Caldwell emphasized impersonating and old man wasn't just an insult, was an erasure of identity, of dignity, of age itself. "I don't need you to believe me," Elijah said slowly. "I need you to follow protocol." Caldwell's expression shifted. He stepped back and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 6127. I'm checking on a subject suspected of federal impersonation at Birchwood and Maple. Requesting backup. Potentially non-compliant." Elijah heard it all. Potentially non-compliant wasn't a description, was a signal, a code to greenlight the force. Cold air crept in through the slightly cracked window. Elijah knew this wasn't a stop anymore. It was a confrontation. And he, a 73-year-old black man, no matter what title he held, now faced a weapon ready to erase all he had ever been. "Step out of the car," Caldwell repeated, lower but sharper, like barely restrained violence. Elijah held his gaze, hands on the wheel. He knew silence was also a tactics, somewhere between defiance and defense. But Caldwell didn't wait. He drew his gun and aimed at the window, his voice hard. "I won't say it a third time." Elijah inhaled slowly, turned off the engine and opened the door. He stepped out deliberately, hands raised. He didn't bow his head. He didn't apologize. His back was straight, not because he defied authority, but because he refused to surrender his dignity. The cold wind bit through his coat, but he showed no fear. He knew calm was his last defense. Caldwell approached and shoved him against the car. The metal was freezing. Pain shot through Elijah's shoulder, worn joint that flared with pressure. "I'm cooperating," he said, steady. "This is abuse of power. You're assaulting a compliant citizen." But Caldwell kept going, patting him down roughly, with no care for reason or limit. "Your attitude shows resistance," he said, holding Elijah down. "You're not a judge right now. You're a suspect." The words dropped like a sentence. Elijah didn't answer, but his back trembled out of fear because he had just heard the most dangerous thing of all: total erasure. His title, his degrees, 4 decades of justice wiped away in seconds by a man with a badge and a bias. In Caldwell's eyes, he'd never been a citizen, never a judge, just a black man who didn't obey. Every word, every shove was its own trial, where truth and identity no longer mattered. In that moment, Elijah Freeman was no longer himself, and he knew the worst was still to come. Caldwell stepped back half a pace after finishing the search, eyes still fixed on Elijah like he hadn't found what he wanted. Then, without warning, his right hand went to his shoulder, not to adjust the radio, but to press a small button on the body cam mount. A faint click sounded. Elijah heard it clearly, like a handcuff unlocking. The red light that had been blinking steadily at the edge of Caldwell's shirt suddenly shut off. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't protest or question. He just stood still, breathed deeply, and mentally recorded every detail: the time, the location, the angle of the car, the wind direction, the nearest house number, the patrol car's license plate. Every detail was stored, like a reluctant witness in his own case. Caldwell moved on to what he called a sobriety check. He waved a finger quickly in front of Elijah's eyes. "Follow the motion. Don't turn your head, just your eyes." Elijah complied, eyes straining. Then came the physical commands. Step back 5 times. Forward 3, stand on 1 foot. Arms out. Completely unreasonable for a 73-year-old man who had just been shoved like a suspect. Elijah tried. He lifted his left leg, balanced for a few seconds, then wobbled and had to set it down. Sweat dotted his forehead. His left shoulder throbbed. "I have a heart condition," he said, breath heavy. "This test isn't appropriate for my age." "The law doesn't exempt anyone for age," Caldwell said with fake moral authority. "I see clear signs of impairment." Elijah clenched and released his fists. He knew reacting would only justify the gun still pointed at him, not because he was afraid, but because he knew how this system worked. What isn't recorded doesn't exist, and that camera, his only witness, had just gone dark. In the distance, a sound window closing or a phone being readied. Elijah looked over his shoulder. 3 houses away, a middle-aged man stood on his porch, phone aimed straight at him. The reflection on the screen showed that the camera was rolling. The angle wasn't close, but maybe close enough. And sometimes, a fragment of truth you live long enough to tell can save the whole story. Elijah didn't smile. He shifted his stance, faced forward, hands still raised slightly. He knew the red light on Caldwell's shoulder might be gone, but a screen across the street had replaced it. It was slim, almost desperate, but it was something. Then came the low hum of a second patrol SUV. White-gray paint, Unit 6093. Rolled up slowly and stopped 10 meters from Elijah's Cadillac. A neatly dressed officer stepped, nameplate J. Brennan. Composed walk, gray hair trimmed, nothing like Caldwell's rage. Elijah recognized him from a federal lawsuit. Brennan had refused to report racial bias in his department. The case was tossed for lack of internal evidence. Elijah never forgot. Brennan approached, glanced at Elijah, and paused just long enough for recognition to show. A flicker of hesitation. No words, no orders, no hand on his weapon, just a look. Elijah saw it clearly, a man realizing he was standing in front of someone important and watching a mistake unfold. Caldwell came closer, said nothing to Brennan, just exchanged a glance. They leaned in, one whisper, a nod, a shrug. Then Brennan turned back, expression wiped clean. "Sir, I need you to sit on the curb," he said flatly. "We're verifying your identity." Elijah looked straight at him, voice calm, steady. "You know who I am, don't you?" Brennan didn't answer. Caldwell smirked, muttered just loud enough, "Better move fast before the crowd shows up." What they feared wasn't justice, was a camera. Elijah didn't sit. He stood tall in his brown coat. He'd stood like that before 12 federal judges, and when delivering a not guilty verdict in a case he knew had been staged. But this was the first time he felt everything he stood for being crushed, silently. A voice rang out in the distance. "He didn't do anything! I'm recording!" It carried across white-painted walls and well-trimmed hedges, places where politeness couldn't hide generations of prejudice. Elijah glanced that way. The man was still filming, maybe live streaming. Maybe, for the first time that day, Elijah wasn't entirely alone. Then Brennan pulled out his radio, requesting another unit, intersection of Birchwood and Maple. Possible non-compliance, proceeding with detainment to secure the scene. No charge, no violation, just a new invisible label stuck to Elijah, potential threat. And with Brennan's nod, the thin line between misunderstood and crushed was erased. The steel handcuffs tightened slightly around Elijah's wrists as Caldwell pushed him into the back seat of the patrol car. The seat was cold, pressed against a glass partition, and unpadded. Elijah sat still, back straight, eyes gazing out the right side window. Brennan didn't ride with them. The door shut. No Miranda rights were read. The engine started. The SUV pulled away slowly from the corner of Birchwood and Maple. Through the mesh divider, Elijah saw Caldwell's shoulders tense as he spoke into the radio. "Dispatch. Unit 6127 en route to the station. Suspicious activity was observed in the vehicle. I'll inspect the interior before impound." His voice was loud and deliberate, to inform but to build a record. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. The words echoed in his mind like puzzle pieces in a pre-written indictment. Suspicious, questionable behavior, interior search. He knew this type of man. He had presided over cases built on nothing but well-orchestrated setups, but this time he wasn't behind the bench. He was the one framed, and Caldwell was preparing the final scene. The vehicle didn't head to the station right away. It pulled over on a quiet road with no traffic cameras. Caldwell turned off the engine, got out, and circled back to the Cadillac, which had already been seized. Elijah turned to look through the left side window. Caldwell opened the trunk, key needed. The car was already in custody. His hand moved inside like it already knew what to look for. There was no search. No surprise, just the movements of someone who already knew what they would find. 3 minutes later, Caldwell returned. In his right hand, he held a small plastic bag. Inside, white powder, sealed in 2 layers of thin plastic. He raised it to the radio like a hunter lifting a trophy, confirming the discovery of suspected narcotics, requesting on-site analysis prior to initiating the arrest report, Caldwell said flatly, though his eyes couldn't hide the thrill. He didn't look at Elijah. He didn't need to. In his mind, the man in cuffs had already been classified. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to ask, "Where did that come from?" or "How did it get there?" He simply looked. But this time, it was no longer the gaze of quiet endurance. It had become something of the same stare that once made false witnesses tremble on the stand. The gaze of a man who could unravel lies with a single question at the right moment. In the mirrored frame of the patrol car window, Elijah saw himself. Stern face, white collar slightly wrinkled, silver hair parted to one side. But the eyes, those eyes were unchanged. He knew this wasn't a mistake. This was a plan, a trap, methodically laid, needing only an untraceable lab result to complete it. That small bag, placed in the trunk of a Cadillac he had locked, wasn't evidence. It was a message, a sign that even the law could be twisted to swallow the very people who built it. The gates of the Oakwood Heights precinct opened. The patrol car pulled into the lot like it had completed a by-the-book mission. Caldwell exited first, opened the rear door, and pulled Elijah out without a word. The cold cuffs still clamped on his wrists. The officer's manner calm, as if everything was routine, legitimate. Inside the holding intake area, Caldwell placed the bag of white powder on a steel desk in front of the booking officer. Alongside it, a short, sloppily handwritten report. Subject found in possession of suspected narcotics inside personal vehicle. Mental state unconfirmed. Elijah stood silently behind him. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a cold green glow that made his face look even more pale. A female officer at the desk asked, "Any special medical conditions we need to know about?" Caldwell replied instantly, without turning, "No, he's talking fine. no signs of distress. The speed of the response made Elijah wonder if it had been rehearsed. He was led into a single holding cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him. Inside, a single metal bench bolted to the wall, a cold steel sink, and an exposed toilet. No windows, no cameras, no one else. 5 minutes later, the first signs began to appear. Pressure built in his chest. His heartbeat became erratic. His right hand trembled, then turned numb. Elijah tried to breathe deeply, to stay calm, but dizziness forced him down onto the bench. Sweat broke across his forehead and neck. He lifted a hand to his face, his vision narrowing. A shadow grew from the edges of his sight, as if his body were preparing to shut down. He knocked on the door, a dull sound. No response. He knocked again, harder. Finally, a figure appeared. Young officer, no name tag, approached and peered through the vertical slit. "I need medical," Elijah said, forcing the words through rapid breath. "History of heart problems? These are warning signs." The officer glanced, then shrugged. "You're under investigation. No medical processing yet." Then he walked away, leaving Elijah with the pressure spreading in his chest. Elijah slumped, back against the cold wall, hands over his chest. The rhythm inside him was now a chaotic drum, pounding from within, either trying to rouse a system outside that had fallen asleep, or one that had chosen not to listen. Elijah never thought he'd die at the hands of a police officer. He believed his greatest enemy was extremism, the forces that fought progress, openly. But now he understood. What might kill him wasn't a gun, but a system that chose to look away. In the haze that followed, he clung to fragments of memory. The patrol car's license plate, 6127. The body cam turned off around 2:38 p.m. The bag of white powder was placed in the trunk after it was locked. And Brennan's eyes, as he turned away, eyes that knew the truth but chose silence. Elijah was wheeled into Oakwood Memorial's emergency room on a stretcher, his heart rhythm erratic on the mobile EKG. One wrist was cuffed tightly to the steel bed rail, the skin swollen and reddened from prolonged pressure. His face was pale from lack of blood to the brain, with cold sweat on his forehead, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. As two medics were hooking up a blood pressure monitor, the ER doors swung open. A doctor in a white coat, neatly combed, graying hair walked in briskly, then abruptly stopped when his eyes caught the name on the chart at the bedside. Freeman. Elijah. He frowned and turned to the nearby nurse. "Are we sure this is Freeman from the Supreme Court?" The nurse hesitated. A nearby officer cut in coldly. "Not confirmed. That's what he claims." That doctor was Dr. Raymond Lynn, head of emergency medicine, a former medical advisor in multiple federal trials. Lynn didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer into the room. When he saw Elijah's face clearly, his expression changed. It was a face he'd seen before, not just in photos, but in person. The National Forensic Conference at Yale, where Elijah had spoken about the link between medical error and judicial outcome. Unmistakable, undeniable. "That's Justice Freeman," Lynn said firmly. "The real one." The officer didn't blink. "Could just be a look-alike. We're following the procedure. No federal ID match yet." The words landed like a lockbolt, keeping all civil rights behind a curtain of system access. Dr. Lynn bent down, checking the heart rate and reading the chaotic vitals. He turned back. "I need these cuffs off. He's experiencing acute cardiac distress. Without intervention, death is likely within 30 minutes. The officer shook his head. "Can't remove them without orders from higher up." Lynn clenched his jaw, staring at the hollowed face before him. As a doctor, he couldn't let anger interfere, but as a citizen, he felt ashamed not at the system, but at the silence of those closest to the truth, who still chose to look away. In that moment, Lynn pulled his personal phone from his coat pocket. He snapped a quick photo of the patient's full name, birth date, and emergency status, typed a short message with the image, and sent it to a close friend in the Department of Justice. No explanations, just 3 words. "Verify this now." A small act, nearly instinctual to him. It was the last resistance he had left, when medical judgment was no longer respected in its own domain. As the message was sent, Dr. Lynn stayed beside the bed, resting his hand gently on Elijah's trembling arm. "I don't know what happened to you," he whispered, But I won't let this disappear. In the stark white light of the emergency ward, where human life dangled between policy and power, a quiet defiance had begun to stir the machinery from its slumber, and the name Elijah from Ardenne, by guns, cuffs, and databases, had just been affirmed by the first person willing to say, "He's real." Michael Freeman burst out of the ICU elevator like a storm under pressure, white shirt wrinkled, tie loosened, collar still damp with sweat from his rushed drive across town. A nurse friend at Oakwood Memorial had texted urgently, "Your father's in the ER, unclear condition, but he's in police custody, admitted under criminal detainment." Michael didn't ask questions, he just drove like the road itself was one long unanswered question. At the reception desk, he flashed his attorney ID, stated his relation to Elijah Freeman, his father, only for the nurse to reply softly, avoiding eye contact, "The patient is under law enforcement supervision. The ICU is locked down. We don't control visitation." Michael didn't argue. He simply nodded and headed straight for the South Corridor, where the digital board read, ICU West Wing. 2 officers stood outside the isolation unit. One was young, hand hovering near his holster. The other, older, with tired, detached eyes, like someone used to blocking people at doors. Michael raised his ID again and spoke plainly. "I'm his son. I'm requesting to enter, not for medical interference, just to confirm my father's condition." The younger officer folded his arms. "Orders from upstairs. He's under investigation for possible identity fraud and possession of controlled substances." Michael stayed calm. "Do you know who's lying in that bed?" The question wasn't a strike. It was a warning, but the older officer just shrugged. "He says he's someone. Anybody can say they're the Pope." The words echoed down the silent hall like a slap. Michael looked him dead in the eye, not with anger, but ice. His fury didn't boil. Froze, like a thin sheet of frost over every heartbeat. Without a word, he pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and began recording from the ICU room, signed to the officers' faces, and spoke clearly. "I am Michael Freeman, attorney, son of Supreme Court Justice Elijah Freeman. I am being denied access to visit my father in critical condition, despite presenting full legal identification." Then, Michael called Eliza Chen. No small talk. "Eliza, hit record. We've got a family access violation at a hospital. I think it's time the press knew." Eliza didn't ask. She just said, "Send me the first 60 seconds. I'll handle the rest." Michael hung up, selected the video, and sent it to 3 people. Eliza, a senior Capitol Ledger journalist, and a media liaison at the Federal Justice Watch. An hour later, while Michael still stood barred outside the ICU, the video had already reached the press circuit, and the first question asked wasn't about Elijah Freeman's condition. Why is a Supreme Court justice being treated like a nameless suspect pulled from a back alley? While the system pretended it couldn't yet verify his identity, the nation was about to realize that this denial wasn't a mistake, was a choice. The blood test and ECG results were uploaded from the ER to the hospital system in under 10 minutes. Dr. Raymond Lynn glanced at them once, then immediately closed his tablet. Elevated troponin levels, irregular heartbeat, and fluctuating blood pressure, clear indicators of a high risk for acute myocardial infarction if not closely monitored. He didn't hesitate. The order to transfer Elijah Freeman to the ICU was signed on the spot, along with a short but weighty note in the report. Patient experienced unreasonable delay in emergency care while in custody. In medical circles, that was a direct punch to law enforcement protocol. The news began to spread quietly, like a current under the surface. In staff lounges, labs, and behind hallway doors, people whispered about a high-profile patient, handcuffed, nearly dying due to delayed care. Many nurses had heard of Elijah Freeman through the media or academic talks. The silence from the medical system began to crack as professionals realized the man straggling life and death wasn't some average suspect. He was a living symbol of justice. At exactly 9:00 IEM, Eliza Chen arrived at the hospital's administrative office, gray tailored suit buttoned high, a thin but firmly held folder in hand, and eyes that didn't waver. She presented an emergency legal authorization signed by Michael Freeman, demanding access to all medical records, ICU hallway camera footage, and intake reports from the night before. Police intervened immediately. A legal oversight representative said, "That information is part of an ongoing criminal investigation. Access is denied." Eliza didn't flinch. "I am preparing to file a federal civil rights lawsuit, 42 U.S.C. 1983, for willful medical delay in violation of human rights." Her voice was steady, but sharp as a scalpel. Tension escalated. The medical team was caught between professional obligation and administrative pressure from law enforcement. Both sides pushed blame onto the other, but any misstep would land squarely on their shoulders. As Eliza prepared to leave to file an emergency petition, a young nurse, barely in her 20s, visibly nervous, walked past and quietly slipped a folder wrapped in a light brown file envelope into her hands. No words, no eye contact, just a swift movement. Inside were copies of the original admission documents, patient info, check-in time, emergency notes, and one especially critical line, handwritten by Officer Caldwell. Subject admitted. While conscious, no urgent medical need. Below that, a faint but legible signature. The issue. The system's recorded check-in timestamp clearly showed that Elijah had displayed signs of heart failure nearly 25 minutes before the handcuffs were removed. A detail that might seem small, but to Eliza, it was the spark that could burn down the entire procedure wall the police were trying to build. A temporary conference room on the 3rd floor of Oakwood Memorial, usually reserved for healthcare organization guests, was repurposed for a quiet negotiation. Chief Raymond Morris of the Oakwood Police Department entered, wearing a dark suit, muted blue-gray tie, and the calm face of someone who had weathered dozens of media firestorms. Beside him was Lawrence Pike, the department's legal advisor, described by the press as the man who can make the truth look like a typo. Michael Freeman and Eliza Chen were already seated. No greetings, no handshakes. Just open folders and a voice recorder on the table. Morris sat, placing down a thick stack of unbound papers, tied with a thin red ribbon. "We're here to close this matter in a way that minimizes damage for all parties," he said, his voice low and practiced. Inside the folder was a carefully worded, unnamed agreement. All charges against Elijah Freeman would be dropped, records scrubbed from internal systems, accompanied by a formal note declaring the detainment was a case of mistaken identity with no racial bias involved. In return, the Freeman family would not disclose any details regarding the arrest, detention, hospitalization, or medical condition. All media responses would be handled internally. No lawsuits, no public statements, no compensation. As Eliza flipped to the appendix, the most glaring detail appeared. There was no mention of Officer Ryan Caldwell, no apology, no admission of misconduct, and most importantly, no permission to use Elijah's medical file in any civil or criminal proceeding. Michael scanned the pages, then looked up. "Let me ask plainly, if my father weren't a Supreme Court justice, if he were just an ordinary man, no power, no fame, would you still be here with this offer?" Morris gave a faint smile. No denial, no excuse, just ordinary people don't make headlines. It wasn't callous, it was the cold truth. Eliza closed the folder, untied the red ribbon, and placed it aside. She didn't argue. She just stared at Morris, voice low but blade sharp. "You're not looking for justice. You're looking to bury this. Unfortunately, we're not ready to die with it." Morris didn't reply. He glanced at Pike, signaling to retrieve the documents. The negotiation ended after 13 minutes. No signatures, no commitments, no handshakes. But the footsteps of the two men leaving the room were no longer steady, because they knew, from this moment on, the Freeman case was no longer in their control. On the way back, Lawrence Pike started calling the department's internal media team. Inside police headquarters, several emails were marked urgent. Subject line, image management and messaging for Oakwood Memorial situation. The Oakwood Police Department officially entered damage control mode. They would no longer keep Elijah Freeman in the shadows. Not out of guilt or integrity, but because they understood. Too much light was coming from too many directions. The media had caught wind, legal organizations were asking questions, and most importantly, the Freeman family, once urged to stay silent, had chosen to speak. The battle was no longer behind closed doors. It was moving into the public eye. The ICU door opened softly. The sound of leather shoes echoed lightly against the gray-white tile floor as Chief Raymond Morris entered, holding a thin folder. He was alone, unaccompanied by any officers, with no prior notice. He wore a dark navy suit with no department insignia, only a small flag pin on his lapel, the kind worn by men accustomed to crisis management before the press. Strangely, no one stopped him. By the time Eliza Chen was informed, Morris was already standing beside Elijah's bed, one hand resting on the steel bed rail, his expression polite to the point of discomfort. "I came to check in," he said, "and to confirm the status of the investigation. This won't take long." Elijah said nothing, simply gesturing for the nurse to step away. His eyes weren't wary or warm, just the look of a man who knew the game had never really ended. Morris didn't sit. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if sharing confidences between men who understood the stakes. "I'm sorry for what happened, Justice Freeman. There were clearly some failures in procedure. But before this turns into a full-scale institutional battle, I'd ask you to consider, out of respect for the community and to preserve things more valuable than reputation." Elijah remained silent. His right arm was attached to an IV drip. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. Morris continued, "A man's reputation isn't built by speech, it's preserved by knowing when to step back." The words were smooth, polished, but between each phrase lay traps of compromise, concession, quiet settlement. "I'm not here to save a reputation," Elijah said, his voice rough but firm. "I'm here to save the truth." That simple sentence made Morris narrow his eyes slightly. He adjusted his posture, leaning in even closer, as if to whisper something meant for no one else. "Reality and truth aren't always the same, Justice Freeman," he murmured. "You know that better than anyone. What's true doesn't always get believed, and what gets believed is usually told by whoever speaks first." Elijah didn't respond, but his gaze didn't break. That silence wasn't avoidance, it was rejection. When the man across from you wraps harm in words, silence becomes the only shield they can't pierce. Out in the hallway, Eliza Chen had returned and saw that Morris was still in the room, though now silent. She stepped inside, but Elijah motioned her not to interfere. Everything was already clear. Morris straightened, adjusted his cuff like a man who had just completed a cordial visit. No handshakes, no farewells. Elijah turned his face toward the window. Midday sunlight streamed across the sill, falling gently on the white blanket covering half his body. Quiet, pure, and as solitary as truth in a room full of power. As Morris left the room, his pace was neither rush nor hesitant. It seemed he hadn't come to conclude anything, because he had already decided. The negotiation was over. What followed wouldn't happen in a hospital room or on paperwork. It would unfold elsewhere, where law, public opinion, and the shadows of power collided. Chief Morris walked calmly through the gray-white corridor of the ICU. His footsteps were even, courteous, unhurried, as if the conversation he'd just had were just another item on his agenda. As he passed the threshold between the ICU and the admin wing, he paused, turning halfway, not addressing anyone in particular, not even facing a security camera. He let out a casual remark. "You've got grandkids at Oakwood Prep, right?" He didn't wait for a reaction from the room, didn't ask for confirmation. Morris smiled, a thin, deliberate smile, hard to label as either cordial or menacing, then turned and walked off, adjusting his cuff once more as though he had just completed a formal protocol. Inside the room, Eliza froze. That sentence, short, without accusation, free of overt threat, sent a chill down her spine. She tapped the recorder clipped inside her shirt pocket, replaying the last part of the exchange. Morris's voice rang out, precise, cold, masked in diplomacy. No illegal words, but each syllable had been chosen to deliver a clear message. "I know where your family is. I know where your grandchildren are." It took Eliza less than 5 minutes to act. She stepped outside and called Michael. "We need to get the kids out of that school now," she said, without explanation. Michael didn't ask. They were too familiar with how the system spoke in coded warnings. Threats that never made it into official transcripts. Within 2 hours, Maya and Nathan, Elijah's grandchildren, were quietly withdrawn from Oakwood Prep. A private vehicle picked them up. No media. No explanation to teachers or classmates, just an unusually quiet afternoon in which the Freeman family vanished from the rosters of the most prestigious school in the state. That same night, Eliza contacted a federal witness protection cybersecurity specialist. They scanned Michael's phone, smart appliances, private vehicle, and even their email server. This wasn't out of fear, it was out of principle. Never let truth be blindsided by the dark. When a system begins using personal information as warning shots, it's no longer a misunderstanding, it's instant. From that moment, the battle was no longer between a wrongly detained man and an overreaching officer. It had moved beyond misconduct. This was now a full confrontation between two powers, one built on rank, orders, and enforced silence. The other, a family without armed protection, but in possession of the only thing strong enough to outlast violence, truth. And Elijah, upon hearing the recording from his daughter-in-law, simply closed his eyes for a long moment. He didn't ask her to replay it. He showed no anger. He only said one thing: "They think we're afraid because we're old, but what they just touched was our future." From the foot of his ICU bed, a quiet resistance had officially begun. Not with a weapon, not with a lawsuit, but with the will to ensure the next generation never bows their head. The heart monitor by Elijah's bedside was no larger than a human palm, light gray, with a sensor tube attached to his left chest. It was a modern medical device, programmed to automatically log abnormal fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure during recovery. But what few noticed, except deeply trained physicians, was that it also had a clinical audio recording feature. Normally reserved for specialized research or drug trials, that feature became Elijah's hidden door out of the dark. After Chief Morris left, Elijah asked the nurse to recheck the device stats, then pretended to doze off. Once the room quieted, he reached out and pressed two buttons on the side, simple, precise gestures, and playback mode activated. A faint sound played, just loud enough for Elijah to hear, but not louder than the rhythmic beeping. Morris's voice, deep, steady, unmistakable, emerged. "You've got a grandkid at Oakwood Prep, don't you?" Then silence, then the sound of footsteps walking away. Elijah listened twice. Every word, every pause was captured. The time matched the hallway camera footage of Morris leaving the ICU. Elijah didn't smile. He wasn't angry. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Real power didn't come from arrest warrants. It came from making people stay silent out of fear. Elijah told no one. Not Eliza, not Michael. He didn't send the recording. No one knew. In the brown leather notebook under his pillow, he wrote one line: personal threat evidence involving institutional leverage. Do not act prematurely. For him, releasing the audio now would be like firing the first shot before entering range. Doing so would only erase traces, silence witnesses, and push the other side into defense. But keeping it, silently, discreetly, was different. It became a ticking bomb. No one knew when it would detonate. And that, to those who understood how systems worked, was how you made the system afraid of you. That night, during the shift change, Elijah called over a young nurse, the one who had once whispered that he was the reason she studied law at night. He wrapped the medical device in an old pacemaker pouch and labeled it Physiological Response Data for Med Student Nephew. The nurse looked at him for a moment, understanding without words. She took the pouch without opening it, slid it into a document cart, and left. No digital footprint, no tracking system, just a simple act as quiet as transferring patient records, but inside was a volatile shard of an invisible system. When the ICU door closed again, Elijah leaned back, eyes shut, angled slightly toward the faint ceiling light. He knew he wouldn't have much time to recover, but this battle wasn't waiting for him to be strong again. It had already begun. Not with a lawsuit, not with a speech, but with an audio clip under 10 seconds long. A casual question, but one that would become a confession if released at the right time. And that's why he didn't need to shout. He just needed to remain silent. the right way. Lying still in the ICU bed, Elijah's mind worked like a war room. During recovery, he didn't let the days go by idly. Each morning he requested pen and paper, not to write memoirs, not to justify anything, but to sketch sharp legal analyses, as cutting as any Supreme Court opinion he had once authored. He dissected every flaw in the accusations. No warrant to search the car, no valid cause to open the trunk, no witnesses beyond law enforcement. He listed the procedural violations: failure to read Miranda rights, delay of urgent medical care. For each point, he cited federal law by hand, carefully marking each clause from 42 U.S.C.S. 1983, the civil rights statute he had once used to defend thousands, now preparing to use for himself. But Elijah knew no real counterattack could rest on a single wronged man. To dismantle a broken structure, you need a broader map. He asked Eliza and Michael to quietly start a review, gathering all complaints, dismissed suits, and insufficient filings from black citizens in the Oakwood area over the last 5 years. The initial list held over 200 cases. They began sorting, line by line, note by note, case code by case code. Then a pattern emerged. In over 70% of the dropped reports, the first name listed in the arrest records or incident report was Ryan Caldwell. Eliza sat in front of Elijah, holding a near 300-page breakdown, her voice cracking. He's in all of them, sometimes as a first responder, sometimes lead officer, sometimes the only witness, and then the case gets dropped for lack of evidence. Elijah wasn't surprised. He nodded slowly and said, "Caldwell isn't the problem. He's the symptom. The disease is somewhere else." He knew no officer alone decides who enters the system and who vanishes from it. That takes a silent mechanism, one that erases resistance, legalizes violations, and coats it all in polished paperwork. That afternoon, Elijah requested hard copies of all the data, an outdated move in the digital age, but he refused to let anything disappear due to system errors. The papers were grouped, color-tagged. Elijah labeled the file, "The Unheard." Elijah gave a faint smile. "Then we'll let them speak. With files, with names, and with questions the system can no longer avoid." From the ICU bed still wired to a heart monitor, a plan was taking shape, not to clear one wrongful arrest, but to illuminate a structure built never to be seen. Elijah Freeman understood this fight wasn't about restoring his reputation. Reputations could die quietly, but if the broken machinery remained, hundreds more names would be lost, like white pages in a locked file. And he, a man who once swore to uphold the Constitution line by line beneath bureaucratic ink. Over the weekend, the temporary office that Eliza and Michael had set up in the basement of an old law building was silent. Only the sounds of keystrokes, a whirring printer, and the cold glow of 2 large monitors filled the space. As they combed through every accessible case file, the Georgia Judicial Database allowed under investigative attorney access. Michael searched for keywords related to racial bias, abuse of authority, and improper asset seizure. Eliza focused on cases that had been closed without trial. After over 4 hours, they found something off. Dozens of lawsuits from Oakwood's black community over the past 5 years had ended under vague circumstances. Many were marked withdrawn, settled privately, or closed due to plaintiff non-researchin just days after filing. Some had disappeared from the system altogether, vanishing from the received log as if they had never existed. Michael double-checked the access level. They were on the state system, not local, and confirmed there was no display error. The plaintiffs were real. They had filed documents, received confirmation receipts, and had case numbers, but no traceable next steps. It was as if someone had wiped the official trail clean, leaving only strange blank spaces, blank enough that no one questioned them. Eliza, relying on the instincts she'd honed investigating buried cases, began organizing the names. She filtered them by profession, neighborhood, property ownership, and education level. The pattern snapped into view. Over 80% were people of color. Most hold college degrees or higher. Many were small business owners, teachers, engineers, architects, and residents of neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. And one more thing, Every one of them had previously challenged government agencies, be it zoning permits, land use plans, or calls for financial transparency. Eliza stared at the summary chart. The overlap was too high to call a coincidence. "This isn't a clerical error," she said. "It's deliberate erasure." She opened a new Excel sheet, pasted all the data in, and titled it, "The Silenced in an Open System." In her gut, she knew this was no longer about Elijah alone. This was a fight against a systemic form of exclusion, where justice was advertised openly, but the doors behind it only opened for the chosen. Michael sat still for a long time, then asked, "If they can erase this many people from the system without a trace, what's stopping them from doing it again?" Another Elijah, arrested, slandered, and wiped clean like he'd never existed? It was a question with no answer, because the question itself was the alarm. 3 days after discovering the list of missing cases, Michael met with a former programmer for Oakwood's civil record system, a quiet man who had resigned following an internal dispute over data privacy. They met at a cafe in Decatur outside Oakwood, avoiding public-facing cameras. The man was in his 40s, with thin, sleep-deprived eyes, but when he spoke about the system, his tone was steady and cold, like a software audit report. "Every complaint, lawsuit, or administrative petition goes through a 3-step intake process," he explained. "For the first 72 hours, files are in a processing state. They can be edited or deleted without logging who did it. After that, the data becomes permanently encrypted. But before that, it's soft data." Michael clenched his jaw. "Who can edit it?" The programmer shrugged. "Level 3 access. Usually an administrative review team. Temporary permissions granted by the Department of Internal Affairs to local offices. No one knows who's actually doing the editing. You can see who approved the final status, but not who wiped what." He added, "The system was built to filter duplicates or abuse. Used wrong, it becomes a cleanup tool with no fingerprint." Back at the office, Eliza pulled every file marked with technical rejections over the last 5 years. In hundreds of cases, one code appeared over and over again, OX17. She checked. 91% of the cases dismissed for technical format errors or unable to process due to structure had been closed under OX17. At first, Eliza thought it was a glitch, but then she found the internal system code description and froze. OS17 was reserved for cases flagged as beyond acceptable community impact, a rare, high-level internal tag that, once used, classified a submission as incompatible with civil environment. In plain terms, deleted for being too sensitive. She compared the code against the previous list, educated, property-owning people of color who had filed legitimate complaints against police or local government. The result was chilling. Nearly every valid complaint from this group had been routed through OX17 within 72 hours. No notifications, no follow-ups. The most credible citizens were silenced fastest, because they were the ones who could damage the system's image the most. Eliza briefed Elijah on everything. He read each line slowly, eyes fixed on the notes. Finally, he said, "We're not just up against the police. We're touching the operating system of an entire town." No one disagreed, because they knew he was right. This was no longer about a single bad officer or a single moment of abuse. This was about social architecture, where anyone seen as having the wrong kind of influence was quietly removed from the legal flow using the very tools meant to protect them. Oakwood's surface remained peaceful. Lawns were trimmed, schools sent out parent newsletters, the local paper covered the upcoming fall festival. But underground, where data was erased, complaints buried, and codes assigned to entire communities, an earthquake had begun to shake. And this time, the person who uncovered it was the one they'd tried to delete. On a quiet Monday morning, as Eliza Chin was reviewing legal briefs for an internal press conference, a handwritten envelope arrived at the law office, delivered by the receptionist. The writing on the front was fine and slightly slanted, clearly marked Eleanor Caldwell. No phone number, no email. On the back, only a handwritten return address, penned in soft blue ink. Eliza carefully opened it. Inside were 4 pale yellow pages, neatly written in a fountain pen, as if by someone who had once learned correspondence on a typewriter. No flowery introduction, just one simple line at the top of the first page. To Justice Elijah Freeman, from a mother who no longer knows how to teach her son. Eliza brought the letter to the hospital. Elijah, though still receiving IV fluids, was stronger now, alert enough to read. He sat up, took the envelope, and began reading slowly. The letter opened with an apology, not from the law, not on behalf of the police, but from a mother. I'm not making excuses for my son. I do not write to defend him. I only want you to know that some of us once stood on the same side as you, only to watch our own children end up on the other side. I write this letter because I fear that if I don't say it, no one else will speak the truth. Elijah said nothing, only nodded gently and kept reading, his eyes growing heavier with each line. Eleanor recounted her youth as a civil rights activist in the 1960s and 70s, arrested during anti-police brutality protests in Montgomery. She had worked with a local legal aid group, helping black families fight illegal home seizures. She was proud of those years, but everything changed when her son, Ryan Caldwell, enrolled at the Oakwood Police Academy. At first, I thought it was his way of changing things from the inside, she wrote, but by the second year, Ryan became distant. He stopped coming home for holidays. When I asked him about minority communities, he told me I was too soft, too naive. Hearing that, from my own child, hurt more than any slap I ever took from a cop. Eleanor didn't try to explain. She just told the story, softly, detail by detail, that she once went to Internal Affairs to ask why her son never took assignments in diverse neighborhoods, that she once tried to submit a report about an unofficial training group at the academy Ryan joined, only to be ignored. I don't know what path he followed. I only know that when I saw his eyes on television as he shoved you from your car, I didn't recognize the baby I once held on his first day in this world. Eliza turned away briefly at that part, unable to hide the ache in a mother's words about a child she could no longer reach. At the end of the letter, Eleanor wrote, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't believe I deserve it. I only ask to bear witness, not against my son, but against whatever it is that turned him into someone who no longer feels another person's pain. Ryan wasn't born to hate, but something in the system took that from him, and I'm afraid other children are walking through that same door. Elijah folded the letter, placed it on the table, and sat silently for a long time, not in anger, not in sorrow, but because he knew a mother had just given him something stronger than evidence, motive. Eliza picked up on one phrase from Eleanor's letter, enhanced tactical response. She traced it through public records tied to the Oakwood Police Academy, searching the faculty meeting notes from 2011 to 2015, the years Ryan Caldwell trained there. A few cross-referenced queries led her to a hidden index not listed on the Academy's main site, but still cached in an older document platform. TTR program. Tactical Threat Response, in partnership with Liongate Civilian Tactical Training Unit. The name Liongate made Eliza freeze. She remembered it from a media expose involving leaked white supremacist materials at a training seminar in Arkansas. There was no official link between Liongate and the Academy, but in a 2013 internal bulletin, a blurry training photo caption read, Advanced Tactical Reflex Training, Group 4, Instructors, CC and RC. It didn't take long to confirm. RC was Ryan Caldwell. He had been one of 3 cadets selected for advanced preclinical immersion, and CC was a Liongate trainer previously suspended for distributing materials titled Priority Engagement in Unstable Communities, a manual laced with veiled language, references to group-based ethnic behavior traits, criminal suspicion via gait analysis, and lead response strategies in trust-efficient zones. Eliza cross-checked the roster of Caldwell's training cohort and found at least 5 others who had faced discrimination complaints yet still secured positions in rural police departments, places with almost no internal oversight. The tipping point came when a former cadet, now in another profession, leaked a PDF from the Academy's internal archive. The tactical training document titled Emergency Response in Unstable Neighborhoods, opened with a stark declaration. When law enforcement faces distrust, decisive response is not a choice, it's a duty. Across 27 pages, no explicit mention of race appeared, but the illustrations, examples, and scenario exercises all focused on communities of color. Scenario 5, titled Uncooperative Elderly Male, described an officer engaging a black male, 65 plus, refusing to present ID due to personal reasons. Eliza froze. That scenario mirrored, almost word for word, what had happened to Elijah. She compiled the entire file, annotated every section, and handed it to Elijah in a thick printed binder. After nearly an hour of reading in silence, he closed it. His voice was low but steady. Caldwell is a product, not an accident. The system didn't fail somewhere along the line, it failed at the blueprint. Under the sterile hospital light, Elijah simply nodded. Eleanor had said, "I don't recognize my own son anymore." Now they understood why. Ryan hadn't been born a man of hatred, but the system had severed him from community, from empathy, from the very mother who once fought for the rights he now suppressed by force. Eleanor's letter was no longer just a personal confession. It had become living evidence, not against the son she once raised, but against the machine that had molded him into someone even his mother no longer dared to call family. Eliza Chen was no stranger to blank spaces in official records, those hidden lines, disappearing forms from public access systems. But this time, what she found wasn't a gap, it was a shadow. While reviewing the access logs for the Oakwood Police Department's camera system, she discovered an internal server address that didn't match any state-licensed administrative servers. Its code, OakXX Beta, an unusual designation, not listed under public storage, and with no traceable access history through the civilian oversight system. It was a dark server, in the literal sense, running parallel to the main system, yet absent from all official IT capability reports. Intrigued, Eliza dug into technical archives from 6 years ago, back when Oakwood upgraded its citywide surveillance infrastructure. In one faded appendix, she found a single cryptic note: raw data trial storage, pre-algorithmic processing, not public, code, HX Beta. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. The system was designed to store all raw video feeds, body cam, dash cam, and station cams, for the first 48 hours before the footage was optimized for administrative use. In other words, this was the raw truth, the unedited layer, and if any original footage of Elijah's arrest still existed, it would be here. Eliza used her credentials, granted as a state inspector's advisor, to access the OakHX BDA server, but the system refused. No typical error message, just a line. Level 4 authentication required, enter personal code. According to security protocol, Level 4 clearance belonged to only 3 people in the department, and the one directly overseeing this system was Brady Marsh, chief technician, and the original equipment integration consultant during Oakwood's security overhaul. Brady wasn't an invisible cog. He had previously refused to cooperate with the Justice Department audit 2 years earlier, citing tactical device confidentiality, with his refusal signed off by Chief Morris himself. In internal tech circles, Brady had a nickname, the Final Gatekeeper. Eliza sat still before the glowing screen. The password prompt blinked every 60 seconds, a steady reminder that the truth sat just behind a door held by one man. She knew she couldn't access it through official channels, and she couldn't wait for a court order. If the system was wiped before then, the evidence would vanish without recovery. Every minute passing chipped away at the likelihood that the raw clip still existed. To open that door, she had to meet Brady. The problem was, Brady wasn't the type to listen to reason. Brady Marsh, a former military radar engineer, lived alone, used no social media, and never gave interviews. In all public records, he had said exactly 3 things on camera, all variations of, I'm not obligated to explain technical systems to unauthorized personnel. He wasn't someone you approached with warrants or pressure. Eliza understood if they wanted the clip, they couldn't persuade him with the law. They had to say something no one had ever dared say to him directly. The door you guard doesn't just lead to data, it opens onto a justice system being buried second by second. Brady's home sat on the city's northern edge, surrounded by aging pine trees and a weathered wooden fence. A one-story, low-roofed house with no nameplate, no doorbell, just a long dead chimney and a crooked security camera dangling from the porch. Eliza and Michael came unannounced. No summons, no formal letter, only a folder and a handwritten envelope. When Michael knocked, nearly a minute passed before the lock clicked. The door opened just a crack. An older man with wild white hair and a misbuttoned shirt eyed them with the suspicion of someone who'd guarded secrets too long. "I don't talk to journalists, and I don't do interviews," he said, before either could speak. "We're not here for that," Eliza cut in, calm but firm. "We're here about a video, and a question only you can answer." Brady didn't open the door further, but he didn't close it either. His eyes shifted from cold to scanning, as if assessing whether they were worth refusing. Michael handed him the envelope. "Just read this, that's all we ask. Then we'll leave." On the envelope was a familiar script, the slanted handwriting of Eleanor Caldwell. Brady took the letter, didn't invite them in, said nothing, and turned back into the house. They waited in silence for almost 15 minutes. When the door reopened, Brady no longer looked defensive. He didn't meet their eyes. He simply said, "That woman once sent me a petition. I thought she was unrealistic. Now I think maybe she was just ahead of us." Then he looked directly at Eliza. "If I give you the original, you'll release everything?" Eliza didn't respond. But Michael did, immediately. "No, but we'll make sure it doesn't get deleted again." No persuasion, no deal, just the right sentence to the right man. Brady paused. His eyes searched their faces, maybe for some unspoken commitment. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just turned away. When he returned, he was holding a plain black USB drive in an old tin pencil case. He didn't hand it over. He set it on the porch table. "If that ends up in a sealed envelope delivered to your law office tomorrow, don't ask where it came from. And never mention me again." Eliza nodded. No thank you, no dramatic gestures, just a nod from someone who understood that unspoken promises could matter more than 100 signed agreements. As they turned to leave, the door closed behind them without a sound. In the quiet of the pine woods and the weathered roof, Eliza knew they had crossed a threshold, not because they now had the video, but because they had reached a silent place in the system where someone had held the key all along, yet no one had ever dared ask why. And for the first time, he had been asked the right way. The first message came from an unknown number, just 7 words. "Check your name in the system." Michael Freeman was at the law office reviewing footage extracted from Brady Marsh's device when the second message arrived, this time from an old contact inside the city prosecutor's office. "Urgent request under review. Target, evidence interference. Your name proposed. No timestamp, no signature, no warning." But each word pierced directly into the defense system protecting his family. Michael froze for a moment. He had known this day would come. He just didn't expect it to come this soon, or this precisely. Eliza reacted instantly. She rechecked the data chain from the moment they received the device to the encryption of its contents. Everything was within legal time frames. Nothing had been published, shared, or used to support any formal allegation. But they both understood the issue wasn't legality. It was how the system chose to define delay or obstruction of an investigation. If a prosecutor were calculating enough, they could issue a detainment order without involving a judge, claiming imminent risk of evidence tampering. With one keystroke, Michael could be flipped from legal advisor to criminal suspect, accused of interfering with a criminal record. That evening, in a closed strategy meeting, Michael looked directly at his father. "I can step back, shut everything down, keep from becoming bait." But Elijah shook his head. "You're not bait. You're the alarm. If they dare arrest someone defending the truth, The entire system will have to answer that question in front of the public. Eliza was more pragmatic. She laid out two options. Michael could submit the footage to an independent federal committee, removing prosecutorial leverage, or he could keep it and accept the risk of being arrested. Michael chose to keep it. That same night, they activated the contingency legal team, preparing counter-litigation filings, emergency bail applications, and a rapid response media protocol. Simultaneously, Elijah's office, still not officially reopened, began receiving letters, video messages, and shared testimonies from supporters, people who had been silenced, rejected, or erased after reporting abuses. Another said, "I used to stay quiet. Now I want to speak." Small voices, perhaps, but to Michael, they were a fortress. The next morning, just outside City Hall, two men in plain clothes asked Michael for ID. He wasn't arrested, merely invited for questioning. But the invitation came without paperwork, just a familiar maneuver from a system testing its opponent's reflexes. Michael didn't flinch. He handed over a business card. "If you need me, call my attorney first. I am one." Then he walked on, back straight beneath a slightly rumpled shirt. From now on, the truth wasn't just stored on servers or USBs. It was being carried in full daylight by someone who didn't need a permit or a court to protect it. A text arrived from Eliza's media aide. Just 3 words. "They've started already." Attached was a link to an article on a far-right Southern media site. The headline read, "Judge Elijah Freeman, once a symbol, now a senile old man?" Elijah skimmed the first lines. Sources claim Justice Freeman has exhibited signs of cognitive decline in recent months. His refusal to retire raises the question, is the judiciary being manipulated by individuals no longer mentally fit to serve? Hundreds of comments followed, half feigning concern, half openly attacking. By evening, 3 nightly political talk shows aired unofficial analysis of Elijah's recent public appearances, from the moment of his arrest to his hospital interview to a quiet press encounter. One body language expert stated confidently, "Signs of disorientation, slow eye movement, and slight hand tremors may indicate early-stage degeneration." No one mentioned he had just suffered a heart attack. No one noted he was still receiving IV treatment. They didn't need the truth. They needed doubt, and they seeded it like an airborne virus across FM waves. The hardest blow came when a forged document surfaced on an extremist political forum, then was reposted by an account with over 300,000 followers. It quoted an alleged internal medical report from 8 years ago, claiming Elijah showed mental instability requiring periodic observation. Eliza immediately responded with a formal denial, attaching an official statement from the Department of Justice Health Office, affirming Elijah had no history of neurological disorders. But the game had already been rigged. In this game, truth was just an option, while doubt spread as if it were law. Mainstream outlets stayed neutral, reporting blandly. New questions emerge about Justice Freeman's mental fitness. After a tense legal meeting, Michael exhaled. They don't need to prove him wrong. They just need to make people believe he might be. Eliza nodded. And once doubt enters the room, no one takes sides, they just turn away. When Eliza was briefed on everything, he chuckled faintly. His voice was quieter than usual. When they can't find a court to reverse the truth, they'll reach for a hospital file. When there's no record left to erase, they'll try to blur the face of the one who wrote it. He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "If they want the public to judge me, then I'll prepare my case for the people, and this time I'll sign my name first." Inside his hospital room, Elijah requested Eliza bring him a mounted camera, a lapel mic, and a legal draft he had started 3 years ago on how to address false mental health allegations against sitting officials. He began rewriting it, not to cite for someone else but to protect himself, not in a courtroom, but in the last court that mattered, the court of public opinion. That afternoon, Oakwood was unusually bright despite the weather forecast. The Freeman family was focused entirely on protecting Elijah at the hospital and preparing for the public document release, unaware that the back door of the house, once a quiet refuge, was opening again. 2 uniformed officers, with no visible vehicle numbers or body cams, knocked on Elijah's door, claiming to be there to secure the perimeter of an active investigation. Regina, the housekeeper, who hadn't attended any legal briefings, didn't ask much. They presented no warrant, but their tone was firm enough that she didn't refuse, and she wasn't the only one in the house. Upstairs, 12-year-old Maya, Elijah's granddaughter, was in the family room playing on her iPad. From the stairwell, she could hear the front door open. Adult voices, low and fast. Instinctively, without having been taught, Maya stayed hidden. She slipped the iPad from its case, opened the camera app, tapped record, and slid it gently beneath the sofa cushion, angled to capture the dining room. She stayed silent, keeping the lens aimed at the two men whose polished black shoes stepped across the tiles she'd helped clean that morning. One officer opened the kitchen cabinets, spice racks, then the drawer of table linens. The other stood by the door, occasionally snapping at Regina. "Don't record if you're not authorized." Maya didn't flinch. Then, without warning, she saw the officer at the table freeze. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag. The movement wasn't quick. In fact, it was clumsy. He looked around, then bent over, pretending to find the bag beneath the tablecloth. "Here it is," he said. No explanation, no genuine surprise, just a faint smirk that didn't bother trying to sell the lie. Regina stood stunned for a moment, then shook her head. "I cleaned that table this morning. There was nothing there." No one responded. The other man gave a glance, a subtle signal. Both men exited silently. No evidence collected, no report filed. Just a discovery, then gone. Maya didn't speak to anyone. She took the iPad to her room, saved the recording, and renamed the file with a random number to avoid drawing attention. When Regina called out that it was time to leave, Maya simply said, "I need to send Nathan our group assignment." In the car, she airdropped the video to her cousin, who was sitting next to his mom at the hospital. Nathan, 15, was smart enough to know this wasn't a game. He watched the clip once, then immediately sent it to Eliza with one note: "You need to see this, now." Eliza watched it at 7:12 p.m. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen for the full 32 seconds, the exact length of the footage. Within an hour, her media team extracted the video, added captions, blurred Maya and Regina's faces, but left the officer's actions fully visible: his hand, his pocket, and the suspiciously clumsy discover. The file was uploaded to a private cloud labeled Lasso. Source: M. It wasn't released yet, but it was ready. And for the first time in this drawn-out counterattack, Eliza knew they had something undeniable, not from court papers or legal filings, but from a child no one thought was watching. Eliza and Michael sat in front of the computer, replaying Maya's video for the 10th time. No music, no effects. Just 32 seconds of raw footage, handheld, low angle, slightly shaky from beneath a couch cushion. But every movement, every glance, every hesitation of the officer was unmistakable. This was no longer speculation. This was the fact, captured when they believed no one dared to look. Eliza spoke, almost to herself. "If we release this, there's no going back." Michael nodded. Then he opened a private browser and logged into a freshly created account. Username: Oakwood Witness 1. The caption for the video was just 6 words. "This is how justice gets framed." Within the first 15 minutes, the video had over 10,000 views. By the third hour, it crossed 1 million. Before the day ended, lawyers, independent journalists, and civil rights activists had shared it with analysis. No signs of editing. Location matches: patrol route 247 Oakwood on the 18th. No warrant registered in the federal system for that day. One surveillance video expert posted, "Body posture, voice tone, and search movements are inconsistent with trained protocol." This officer knew exactly what he was finding. The next morning, a major newspaper launched a column called Fact Check Freeman, not to discredit but to verify every claim surrounding him. They released a clip citing it as from a credible independent source, after verifying GPS coordinates, matching audio patterns, and timestamp alignment. The headline read, "This is raw, unaltered footage showing an officer planting evidence in the private home of Justice Elijah Freeman." Within 24 hours, hashtags like Justice for Freeman Protect Maya, fake evidence, and body cam is not enough surged to the top of trending lists. One journalist wrote, "Justice wasn't disrupted by a video, it was exposed by a child with no podium, just an eye." At the same time, several TV shows that had previously criticized Elijah paused their coverage. A conservative anchor came under fire for calling him a senile old man on air and was forced to post a vague apology. Other outlets disabled comments and locked down their social media replies. The media storm had turned. It no longer focused on Elijah's cognitive state, but instead asked, who planted the evidence? Who authorized the search? And, more importantly, why is no one taking responsibility? In his hospital room, Elijah watched the clip for the first time on a tablet screen. His eyes didn't blink. His hand rested lightly on the blanket covering his legs. When the screen went dark, he set it on the table and looked out the half-open window. "Not an oath, not a motion," he said slowly, "but a little girl with a camera just saved an entire trial that hasn't even begun." No one replied. They didn't need to. That sentence was enough to close one chapter and open the next, where the system could no longer control the rhythm of the crowd. From that moment on, it was no longer just a legal battle. It was a wave, and for the first time, that wave didn't need permission to rise. The call came at 4:12 p.m. No caller ID. No trembling voice, just one brief sentence over the speaker. "You don't know me, but I work in the department." Before Eliza could respond, the line went dead. 6 hours later, she sat in a worn-out diner on the eastern edge of Oakwood, where the yellow neon barely lit the tabletop. Across from her sat a young woman in a gray hoodie, hood pulled low over her face, hands wrapped around a coffee she hadn't sipped. "My name is Tamara Jackson," she said. "I've been on the force for 14 months. They don't remember me. That's why I'm still here." She pulled a small USB drive from her coat pocket, wrapped in white tape, and placed it on the table, but didn't push it forward. Eliza didn't reach for it. She didn't ask. She waited for Tamara to speak. Tamara talked like someone reliving a recurring dream, a dream she couldn't wake from. She had once believed she could change things from within, but the deeper she went, the more she saw that everything was designed to choke out decency. "They told me to rewrite reports for consistency, and removed my name from patrol assignments in areas with cameras. At first I thought it was random. Then I saw that anyone who spoke up got pulled from key patrols." She paused, eyes scanning Eliza's face, as if to be sure she was talking to someone who would actually listen. "The original body cam footage. It captures everything from the moment Officer Caldwell stepped out of the car. The audio was deleted in the submitted version." She leaned forward. "You'll hear him say, 'Stop him,' before he gets out of the car. And later, there's a voice on the line that says, 'Don't let Freeman get past the checkpoint.'" Eliza said nothing. Her heart pounded, but her hands stayed still. She knew if the clip was real, it wasn't just a blow to the case. It was a direct hit to the entire apparatus behind the setup. But Tamara wasn't finished. The USB also has a chain of internal emails. Subject lines like, "Adjust narrative beyond district." No direct names, but the coordinator is a unit supervisor. Tamara leaned back for the first time, finally touching the cold coffee. Her eyes weren't scared, they were resolute, as if every choice in her life had led her to this moment. When she stood up, she didn't glance at the USB. "Don't try to call back. I'll disappear for a few days. When I resurface, I hope my name isn't on the news." Yet, Eliza nodded without speaking. She waited until tomorrow had stepped out and vanished into the dim city lights before reaching for the USB, light as air. Yet she knew it carried the weight of a testimony that couldn't be taken back. 2 hours after the meeting, Eliza and Michael sat in the small third-floor office, the soft light from the printer unable to cut the tension in the room. Tamara's USB had just been scanned. The original body cam footage existed, and it captured a command from an unknown voice. "Don't let Freeman reach his son's house. Use ID check if necessary, but block him." The voice was unidentified, but internal call logs and GPS metadata traced the order back to the district command center. Eliza didn't speak. She opened the email archive, a series of internal threads titled with chilling simplicity, "Consolidate version before archiving." Recipients included at least 3 unit captains, one of whom had appeared on television, claiming the arrest was by the book. Before they could act, Tamara called again, using another anonymous number. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "My phone's dead. My access card's been deactivated. Someone tried logging into my personal email." She wasn't panicked, but Eliza could tell Tamara was walking as she spoke. A bus terminal, maybe a cafe, or maybe she was already on her way out of Oakwood. Eliza signaled to Michael, who immediately activated a secure line and sent a copy of all data to a civil rights attorney within the Department of Justice. At the same time, they submitted an emergency request for federal witness protection, citing the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act. That night, an internal email leaked and was shared by a former security officer. It read, "If Officer Tamara Jackson does not report for duty by morning, initiate non-cooperation procedure and permanently seal personnel file. No warning, no hearing, just a bureaucratic process to erase her as a dissenter." Eliza understood. This was no longer an internal investigation. It was a purge. They weren't managing the truth. They were eliminating the messenger. That same night, a small extraction team was deployed. 3 cars, 5 people, no GPS, no live phones. Tamara was picked up at an interstate bus stop, transferred through 3 short routes, and temporarily housed in a safe home out west. No questions, no cameras, just silence and unspoken trust among people who knew that sometimes justice doesn't arrive through paperwork, but through a place where real people get to stay alive. When confirmation came that Tamara was safe, Elijah sat quietly. In his hands was the printed letter from Eleanor Caldwell. He looked out the hospital window, where the afternoon sun had faded. "Someone inside still wanted to come out," he said. "So it's on us, outside, to open the door." Tamara wouldn't be the last, but she was the first, and Elijah knew, from this moment forward, justice was no longer abstract. It had a name, a face, a real person, now in hiding because she had chosen to speak at the exact right time. The FBI's press release went out at 2:37 a.m. Eastern Time. No warning, no press conference, just a cold, single-page document posted to its official site. Headline unmistakable: Federal launches pattern and practice investigation into Oakwood Police Department under 42 U.S.C. S. 14,141. An hour later, a federal rapid response team arrived at Oakwood PD headquarters. The internal data wing was sealed. All servers, online and offline, were dismantled and packed into encrypted containers. No one was allowed inside, no backups permitted. Several officers tried to intervene, but each objection was met with the simple phrase, "Federal authority temporarily nullifies local protocol." The once quiet hallways, long used to folded reports and unspoken routines, were now lined with agents. No one had imagined such a scene in Oakwood, a town once labeled disciplined and stable. That silence was now broken. Within 24 hours of the lockdown, internal witnesses, silent through every investigation phase, began to speak. A logistics officer described paper files being filtered before submission. A sergeant revealed off-the-record meetings at the captain's home where case narratives were pre-framed before official filing. But the most jarring testimony came from an anonymous IT technician. There was a separate folder. It was called Fall Candidates. It wasn't on the open server, manual access only. Inside was a list of individuals marked "Not recommended for deep engagement with Oakwood administrative process." Eliza immediately requested a cross-check. The list held over 200 names, mostly black individuals with no criminal history, but who had written letters, filed complaints, or publicly challenged local policies in the past 5 years. Teachers, lawyers, journalists, business owners, people who had never made headlines, but now appeared on a covert exclusion list. 80%, Eliza repeated aloud. That's not bias, that's intent. And that intent wasn't found in idealistic dialogues, it was buried in internal memos, directive emails, and notes scrubbed from official records. but still intact in the backup systems the FBI now possessed. The next morning, the front pages of the country's three largest newspapers no longer headlined the Freeman case. It had evolved into a systemic reckoning. Oakwood and the architecture of administrative exclusion. One veteran journalist wrote, "We've talked for too long about individuals acting within systems. But this time we must talk about how the system manufactures those actions. By design." For the first time, the phrase "cover up" embedded in policy appeared on national evening news, not from an activist, but from a criminal law professor who once taught many of those now under investigation. In his hospital room, Elijah placed the paper on the side table. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, not out of relief, but clarity. "They're looking at the right thing now," he said quietly, and he knew, once a door like this is opened from the outside, no one within the system could shut it again without leaving marks behind. The meeting was unplanned. Chief Raymond Morris appeared in the third-floor hospital hallway before dusk. No legal team, no media aid, just a slightly wrinkled suit, a loosely tied necktie, and a slim envelope in hand. Eliza had just exited Elijah's room and froze upon seeing him. They stared for a second. No greeting. Morris gestured a request. Eliza nodded, though not in agreement. He knocked and entered, as Elijah sat by the window, rereading the morning's legal briefing. "We never needed many words between us, Freeman," Morris began. His voice was lower than usual, weary, but steady. Elijah didn't look up. "I remember you saying that to a former mayor before you testified against him 6 months later." Morris exhaled, placed the envelope on the table, but didn't push it forward. "I'm not here to bargain," he said. "I'm here to end it. The department is willing to drop all criminal charges. No resignations, no prosecutions. We frame it as administrative mismanagement. In return, you stop public testimony, avoid the press. We close this with dignity. You step back to applause, and reform happens without the need for a reckoning." Elijah looked up. His eyes no longer carried the fatigue of treatment. They held a chilling clarity. "You're offering me silence in exchange for honor?" Morris stayed quiet. Elijah continued, slower now. "How many more years would my silence buy this injustice? 10? 20? How many children will grow up inside a lie dressed up as order?" Morris took a half step back. Not angry, not confused, but wary. He was realizing he'd misread the moment. "Change takes time," he said. "Sometimes, to fix a machine, you need to keep it from breaking apart first." Elijah closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. "I don't need steps. I need a clean break." When Morris walked away, his face, for the first time, was no longer composed. No justification, no polished rhetoric. Eliza watched from down the hall, knowing the final offer had just been declined. As she re-entered the room, Elijah was already asking for the camera to be set up. "I want to record my first address," he said. "Not for the media, not for the government, for direct broadcast, Friday 7:00 p.m., Elijah asked. "To respond to Morris?" Elijah shook his head. "To respond to myself, the man who once thought this system could be changed from within. Now I know. Change requires the crack to come first." That sentence needed no introduction. It was the end of negotiation, and the beginning of a trial no one had to authorize for justice to begin. The rain had just stopped when Tamara Jackson exited her meeting with federal agents on the western edge of Oakwood. She declined their offer to escort her to her car, simply saying, "I have a few personal things to take care of." The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few dusty cars and the blurred glow of streetlights reflecting off damp asphalt. At exactly 7:46 p.m., a delivery driver heard a loud thud from the far corner of the lot. No one saw anything clearly. The nearest surveillance camera conveniently lost signal due to a temporary transmission error. But less than 10 minutes later, Tamara was found unconscious next to the driver's side of her car, blood at her temple, breathing ragged. She was rushed to Oak Hill Hospital that same night. Initial assessment: minor skull trauma, fractured left rib, and deep bruises from blunt force. Notably, her wallet, phone, and watch were untouched. The FBI ruled out robbery. Their internal GPS system revealed that an unregistered patrol vehicle had stopped in the lot at the exact time of the incident. The driver, a former colleague from Tamara's old unit, one she had previously reported for unusual pressure tactics. A confidential memo listed at least 3 names as persons of interest, but the official response from the department was vague at best. We are cooperating with the investigation. Currently, there is no basis for administrative suspension. Eliza read the release with a face that didn't show surprise, just cold certainty. They won't suspend anyone, because suspension would be admitting she was right. Tamara regained consciousness the next morning under the dim hospital ceiling lights, the steady beep of a heart monitor beside her. Her lips were cracked, her voice so hoarse the agent had to lean in to hear her whisper, "If I don't wake up again, give the last recording to Eliza." She closed her eyes again after that, but her finger twitched, just enough for the agent to know she wasn't surrendering. The recording was saved to a private, encrypted platform Tamara had registered for earlier. Once the FBI unlocked access, an 11-minute audio file played. Words that made Eliza's blood run cold within the first seconds. "Jackson will be the example. The others need to learn. There's no room for betrayal here." The voice was calm, matter of fact. It had been recorded during an off-the-record meeting. No official minutes, no cameras. Captured only by a discreet audio recorder hidden inside Tamara's name tag pen. Eliza sat frozen for a while after the file ended. She didn't need verification, just the way the officers laughed after the threat, mocking, confident, was enough to confirm everything. The crack in the wall had appeared, and it hadn't come from outside. It had come from the very place those who built the system thought untouchable, the fear and silence within. And now that crack was breathing through blood, hospital beds, and a whistleblower's recording. Eliza glanced toward the hallway where Agent stood guard, then back to her laptop screen. "We now have proof that this system is willing to kill to avoid telling the truth," she said. And in her eyes, for the first time since this began, the fight was no longer just legal. It had become a survival decision. Expose it all, or die trying to uncover just a piece. The wave of intimidation didn't start with knocks on doors. It began with silence. On the first night, Elijah's daughter received an anonymous call at 1:12 a.m. evening. No words, just heavy breathing, lasting 47 seconds. On the second night, someone knocked 3 times on her garage window and vanished before the security camera could activate. On the third night, a piece of cardboard was taped to her front door. "Your family should stay as silent as he did." No signature, no explanation, just a clear, chilling message. Meanwhile, Michael's SUV, parked outside the law office, had all 4 tires slashed. No cameras caught the culprit. Nathan, Elijah's grandson, told his mother a white car had followed him through 3 intersections on his way home from school. When Michael requested traffic cam footage, the system replied, "No data available for that time frame." Realizing the escalating personal threats, the FBI immediately moved Elijah into full protective status. 2 agents on 24-hour rotation in the ICU wing, a private surveillance system covering the hallway, and a strict access list of only 3 individuals. However, when Eliza submitted a request to extend protection to Elijah's daughter Michael and the 2 grandchildren, the Justice Department replied, "Request pending approval. No current indication of direct, life-threatening danger." Eliza reread the sentence 3 times. She couldn't believe that, after everything, the only trigger the system needed to act was the spilling of blood, as if lives had to be endangered, visibly, violently, before prevention was justified. The breaking point came on the 4th night. A front yard security camera captured footage of a hooded man standing motionless outside Elijah's daughter's door for 13 minutes. He didn't ring the bell, didn't try to break in. He just stood, still, upright, face fully visible, then turned and walked away, leaving nothing behind. Michael watched the footage with his wife, fists clenched on the armrest. Later that night, he returned to the hospital and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We should move my wife and kids out of the city, at least for a while." Elijah didn't turn. He kept looking out the window, where dim lights flickered from the plaza below. Then he said, "We don't run anymore. not again. If they show up on our doorstep and we retreat, then justice becomes just another word for hiding. Eliza arrived soon after. She listened to Michael's account and stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, she said softly, "The wall is cracking. But walls don't collapse from force alone. They fall when the inside begins to rot." Elijah turned to look at her. His eyes, no longer shadowed with fatigue, carried the clarity of someone who had lived through war, politics, and the bending of the law. He gripped Michael's hand. If this is how they signal collapse, then maybe, just maybe, we're about to win. None of the three smiled, but in that moment their eyes didn't reflect fear or retreat. They held the look of people no longer defending, but preparing to step forward and to finish this. That morning, hearing room 3A in the Rayburn Building, Washington, D.C., was packed to the walls. Reporters jostled for space, cameras were mounted in three corners of the ceiling, and the gallery seats were filled with politicians, lawyers, and civil rights advocates. The nameplate on the desk read, "Justice Elijah Freeman." He was the last to enter. No assistants, no wheelchair, just a 73-year-old man in a deep blue suit, unbuttoned, his gaze unflinching and unprepared in the best way. When the committee chair said, "Justice Freeman, you may begin," Elijah didn't reach for papers. No laptop. He simply raised his head, drew a breath, and opened with a single line. "I once swore on the Constitution not to secure a seat on the Supreme Court, but to protect one simple truth, that no one should be disregarded for standing still." And then he told the story. From the moment he stopped his car in Oakwood, from the first look in the officer's eyes, from when he said, "I'm a justice," and was laughed at. Elijah recounted everything with a mind sharp as a blade. No anger, no trembling, just calm, as if he were drafting a verdict on his own life. He described being cuffed, shoved into the car, and denied medical care, even as he clutched his chest. He paused, then said, "I thought I would die in custody, not from heart failure, but from a system that no longer had the heart to recognize who needed saving." The room fell utterly silent. No keyboard clicks, no interruptions. Some members of Congress bowed their heads. Others wiped their eyes. But a few leaned back, arms crossed, no notes, no questions, as if the truth was too familiar. As if justice was just another word they'd heard too many times to feel. When Elijah spoke of Maya filming the video, he looked up toward the gallery. A child, not elected, not credentialed, not robed, did what an entire system wouldn't dare. She turned the camera on. There were thoughtful stares, and still some blank ones. The hearing ran for over an hour. No one interrupted, no one left. But when Elijah stepped down from the podium, no applause followed. That same afternoon, the hashtag Elijah Speaks climbed to #1 on Twitter, with over 3.7 million mentions. Social platforms replayed clip after clip of the testimony. But the national evening news on several major networks silent. No summaries, no footage, as if what just happened wasn't newsworthy enough to squeeze between finance and sports. On the walk out of Congress, Eliza walked beside Elijah, just as her assistant texted to say 2 major networks had opted not to air the hearing. Elijah only gave a faint smile. "I never needed them to bow. I just needed them to never again say, 'We didn't know.'" He looked out to where the sun was casting its last light on the Capitol dome. And now, that's exactly what they can't do anymore. The truth had been spoken into the record, into the cameras, into the conscience of anyone still brave enough to know the difference between wrong and right. 3 days after Elijah's hearing, Eliza and the legal team officially began rebuilding the full legal map of the case, not as a personal lawsuit, but as a systemic crime diagram. On the meeting table were 3 key columns: Elijah's arrest details, the list of fall candidates pulled from internal servers, and a series of leaked emails from the USB drive handed over by Officer Tamara Jackson. All had one thing in common: no official orders were mentioned. Yet every action, internal file transfer, record modification, Maintain restricted oversight was repeated like an unspoken policy. Eliza pointed to a printout of Oakwood PD's departmental workflow chart. "We're not suing over isolated misconduct," she said. "We're suing a system programmed to erase dissent." The federal lawsuit was filed Monday morning under 42 U.S. Code SS 1183, used for cases of power abuse under color of law. But this time, Eliza didn't just name the arresting officers or those who planted evidence. The complaint targeted the entire process modification structure, people who coordinated emails, approved internal memos, deleted citizen complaints, and even those who remained silent in recorded meetings. Nearly 40 names were listed by tier and role, like a dark org chart, where each actor was just the extended hand of a hidden directive. In the lawsuit summary, Eliza wrote, "We are not suing individuals. We are suing the method by which the system chose to govern its people, through internal orders instead of law." But the most powerful blow didn't come from the court. It came from a live stream hosted by Eliza's team the night the lawsuit went public. During the live broadcast, she launched a campaign called Civil Trap Mapping, a digital map for people across the U.S. to submit records, images, emails, or documents related to covert civil disenfranchisement. In less than 72 hours, more than 600 submissions came in from 18 states, mainly from areas once deemed administratively stable. Many had been denied complaints, removed from community candidate lists, stripped of land rights for failing zoning suitability. Some were teachers, healthcare workers, and local lawyers, all with one thing in common: people of color, outspoken and unwilling to stay silent when wronged. Michael reviewed the cross-state connection map and couldn't help but ask, stunned, "You really think they'll let us see this through?" Eliza didn't look up. Her hand was drawing another red arrow on the litigation chart. She replied quietly but with finality, "No. But this time we've locked the back door. We either move forward or break it down." There was no exit left. No room for negotiation. This was no longer a courtroom case. This was an indictment against the system itself. The indictment was issued during a closed-door press briefing in Washington, hosted by the Department of Justice. No live broadcast. No mainstream media presence. Just a 17-page memo sent to major newsrooms afterward. The list named 34 individuals, all public officials, from patrol officers to command unit leaders, from internal data supervisors to federal budget approvers responsible for Oakwood's surveillance system. At the top of the list, Chief Raymond Morris. Charges: violation of 18 U.S.C. SS 241, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, suppression of administrative misconduct, and tampering with federal data systems to alter investigation outcomes. His handcuffed image never appeared on television, but it spread across social media in under 2 hours. No longer the spokesman of the system, no longer the calm face in front of cameras. When escorted away, Morris said nothing, but his eyes stayed lifted, as if still believing everything could be overturned on a technicality. But Morris wasn't the fatal blow. The real impact came from a lakeside cabin in the northern suburbs, where Ryan Caldwell was arrested after more than 3 weeks on the run. The cabin wasn't listed on travel maps, nor was it registered under any legal name, but it was traced via a gas purchase made with his bank card. When the FBI moved in, Caldwell didn't resist. On the table were yellowed printouts, an old laser printer, and 2 maps pinned to the wall, one charting districts with rising minority populations over the past decade, and another outlining Oakwood's internal administrative response system. But what silenced the agents was a drawer filled with nearly 40 documents, stamped internal use only, plans titled Enhanced Control of High-Risk Administrative Zones, along with internal demographic recordings labeled Section P3, Subversive Influence, the term they used to classify people like Elijah. Among them was a gray, textured envelope marked RC/12, containing contracts for population research in targeted intervention zones between Oakwood PD and two political consulting firms with a known history of funding federal election campaigns. Another contract detailed convert civilians into district-level surveillance agents in exchange for immunity from off-duty misconduct investigations. In reality, it was a recruitment scheme for semi-civilian police, operatives functioning outside the formal chain but covertly funded by local budgets. They planted drugs, tracked targets, intimidated dissent, and shaped narratives, and none of them had official records. The documents also revealed three-way meetings between Oakwood's command unit, private donors, and state-level campaign spokespeople. Elijah read the summary and said only, they didn't just want to kill dissent. They wanted to define dissent as criminal behavior. As the news spread, some television stations that had remained silent began reporting cautiously. There were no apologies, just a shift in tone. On independent platforms, however, the demand to release all declassified materials surged. The hashtag Open Oakwood Files hit over 5 million shares in 2 days. An independent journalist quoted part of the investigation. In over 9 years, the covert filtering system had interfered with 842 valid complaints in Oakwood alone. Neighboring towns with shared data contractors could see numbers 5 times higher. What began as the story of an old man dragged from his car became a question for the nation. How can justice survive when the very hand holding the scales has its finger on the weight? At the internal debrief, Elijah said just one thing. We've gone from being interrogated to interrogating those who ask the questions. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call it a victory, but his eyes were steady and clear. Eliza didn't pause. She immediately collaborated with the DOJ to submit Caldwell's cabin documents into the Civil Trap Mapping Archive, unlocking community legal teams to file coordinated class action lawsuits. What we broke wasn't just a network, she said. It was the logic that justified its existence. With Chief Morris arrested and Caldwell facing multiple federal charges, for the first time, no one stood at the podium to speak on behalf of the system. And in that moment, after decades of imbalance, the scales of justice didn't suddenly balance themselves. They leveled, because the one holding them had finally been dragged into the light. The closed-door Supreme Court meeting that day had no cameras, no speeches, and no formal remarks. But everyone knew this session would be unlike any in recent memory. On the table was Davis v. District Authority, a case involving an unarmed black man who was beaten to the point of permanent disability by police for failing to move quickly on command. The officer responsible avoided accountability under the doctrine of qualified immunity, a legal shield deeply embedded in law enforcement for decades. Elijah was appointed to write the court's official opinion. He didn't object, request reassignment, or hesitate. But when he presented the 26-page draft, everyone in the room could feel it. He had written with the pain of an unhealed wound. More than just voting to narrow the scope of immunity, Elijah used his judicial voice to expose how the doctrine had become a mask. In the opening, he wrote, "We have built legal walls to protect public servants from abusive litigation, but over time, those walls have grown so tall they now block out the pain of the citizens they were meant to serve. Midway, he declared, no title, including mine, justifies standing outside the reach of responsibility." And near the end came the line that shook the national discourse. "I once believed that title and reason could shield us from truth, but sometimes the badge of power doesn't save us. It only makes us easier to erase." The ruling was made public on Wednesday. Within 2 hours, major news outlets circulated Elijah's words, calling it a watershed decision and the most dignified confession ever written from within the system. One legal columnist wrote, "He didn't just wield the gavel, he set it down, looked at where it struck, and asked, how many of those strikes were wrong? Not all responses were positive. Some conservative scholars accused Elijah of injecting personal experience into legal reasoning, while others claimed he had weakened the ability of police to act under pressure. But, regardless of opinion, no one could deny what had just happened. Elijah Freeman did what few ever have: alter the course of legal doctrine by admitting fault, not in a verdict, but in the structure that had long shielded him. When the press conference concluded, Elijah did not attend. He gave no interviews, skipped the celebrations, and wrote no editorial op-eds. Instead, he sent printed copies of the ruling to every state sheriff's office, no note attached. In his office, when Eliza asked if he felt relieved, he simply said, "I didn't write for relief. I wrote so someone else won't have to live through what I lived, just to get the law changed." With that, Elijah Freeman didn't just close a case. He marked the beginning of a new era, one where justice was no longer a privilege of office, but a recognition that the machinery itself needed repair. From the blind spot he had once been cast into, Elijah chose to step forward, not to assign blame, but to redefine how the system should be remembered, not through prestige, but through consequence. On Monday morning, a card from the White House arrived at Elijah's office, silver-edged, embossed with the national seal. Inside was a formal invitation. Justice Elijah Freeman is cordially invited to the National Civil Justice Defender Ceremony held in the East Room, White House, Washington, D.C. You will be awarded the Medal of Civil Liberty for your outstanding contribution to constitutional justice. The ceremony would include the President, Vice President, top federal judges, and national civil society leaders. Eliza read the letter in silence, then handed it to Elijah, who was working at his old wooden desk, still covered in unresolved case files. Behind him, the black and white portrait of Evelyn hung on the wall. Elijah didn't speak. He set the card aside, pulled a small blank sheet from his drawer, and wrote a single sentence in clean, slanted black ink. "I cannot accept an award for something that should never have had to happen." No introduction, no pleasantries. He folded the paper and handed it to Eliza. "Deliver this for me." Eliza paused, wanting to say something, but didn't. She understood. Elijah needed no more spotlights. He had stood before the public, before Congress, before the court, and the last thing he wanted was to be celebrated for a tragedy the nation had allowed to fester for too long, too quietly. The ceremony went ahead as scheduled. The East Room was solemn, simply adorned. Among the arranged seats for honorees was a center chair labeled Justice Elijah Freeman. It remained empty. The host stepped to the podium and said, "Due to personal reasons, Justice Freeman could not attend today's ceremony. However, he has sent a note, which we will now read in full." The note was unfolded and read slowly, word by word. When the final sentence was spoken, the room fell into complete silence. No applause, no whispers, just 10 seconds of stillness, as if a courtroom had opened in that very room, not with declarations, but with quiet judgment. That evening, Eliza recounted the moment to Michael as they sat in the hospital garden where Elijah was still undergoing light therapy. He didn't declined to protest, she said. He declined because he understands there are things greater than justice, like the dignity of knowing when not to celebrate while others are still in danger. Michael nodded, eyes distant. The empty chair in the East Room had become a symbol, not of absence, but of presence, placed in exactly the right time and space to say, "I don't need recognition, I need reform." And that was how Elijah left the light, not with a victory lap, but with a refusal loud enough to make the system look inward, not to apologize to him, but to change itself. There was no press release, no escort convoy, no government vehicle parked out front. Elijah told only Eliza and Michael with a short, quiet sentence that morning, "Tomorrow, I'm going to the cemetery." Neither of them asked why. They knew. It was a trip he'd been thinking about for months, but hadn't allowed himself to take while everything was still unraveling. He wasn't going now because things were finished, but because he knew this visit couldn't be shadowed by podiums or news cameras. Michael offered to send someone with him. Eliza suggested a trusted driver. Elijah simply smiled and shook his head. I don't need protection to stand before the one who taught me how not to bow. At dawn, an old rental car rolled out of the city, winding through rural roads flanked by golden oaks. Elijah sat in the passenger seat, holding a simple bouquet of white flowers, no ribbon, no card. The cemetery lay on a small hill in the Georgia countryside, unmarked by signs, without any grand iron gate, just a low wooden fence and moss-covered stone paths. He walked slowly past the rows of graves, as if each step was an apology to those whose names had been forgotten. Evelyn's grave was at the far end, a quiet corner no one seemed to disturb, yet always clean, perhaps because no one who visited wanted to rearrange it. On the headstone, there were no titles, no degrees, just one line, carved deep into the stone. We tried not to be silent. Elijah stood before that stone for a long time. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't tear, but his lips pressed together, as if something was rising in his throat that he couldn't quite release into words. He placed the bouquet at the foot of the headstone, bowed his head gently, then sat on the nearby bench. "They won't remember who you were," he said softly, his voice low but steady. "They'll remember the day an old man was pulled out of a car and still held his head high. But they won't know that you were the first to teach me how to stand tall." He reached out and brushed the cold surface of the stone with his fingertips, his eyes not focused on the rock, but on something behind it, memory. When he was younger, every time Elijah struggled with a difficult ruling, Evelyn never gave legal advice. She would simply ask, "If I'm gone tomorrow, will you still be able to hold your head up when you look back?" A light breeze swept across the hilltop. A dry oak leaf landed on Elijah's coat, but he didn't brush it away. He just sat still, as though the whole space had paused its breath with him. No one came, no cars, no voices. Elijah felt there was nothing more he needed to say. The headstone had already spoken the words he chose to keep quiet. We tried not to be silent. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a declaration. It was a confirmation that their existence, while it didn't change the whole world, refused to let it go unchallenged. Elijah stood. He didn't turn away right away. He looked one last time, not to say goodbye, but to lock something in memory that he'd almost forgotten in the days when truth was buried under power. And then he walked away, not fast, but steady, a journey that needed no escort, because this time he knew exactly why he had come. Elijah stayed by the grave longer than he expected. He didn't turn on his phone. He didn't check the news. He hadn't brought any device that received a signal. All he had was an old brown leather notebook he always kept in the left pocket of his coat, the same one that had traveled with him through hearings, closed-door sessions, and hospital nights between treatments. Now, the pages were nearly full. Each one carried fragments of memory, some written quickly in anger, others slowly in sorrow. But today, in front of the headstone of the only woman who ever made him pause and listen, Elijah only needed to write one thing. He turned to the final page, took out his familiar black pen, and wrote in slow, straight handwriting. "Silence will not be the native language of this country, not while I'm still alive." He didn't stop to reread it, just exhaled gently, as if releasing a weight he had carried too long. As the sun began to tip past the hilltop, Elijah stood, but instead of putting the notebook back in his pocket, he knelt down, slid aside one flat stone near the base of the grave, and revealed a narrow space between two stacked rocks. He placed the notebook there, not sealed, not wrapped, just placed, like a message that needed no recipient. Maybe in a few years, grass would cover it. Maybe rain would fade the ink. Or maybe someone, someday, would find it, open it, and read. But that no longer mattered to Elijah. He hadn't written it to be read. He had written it so he wouldn't forget that he had come back, and he hadn't missed his chance to say, "I was never walking in the wrong direction." On his way back down from the cemetery, Elijah didn't rush. He walked slowly, taking in everything. The nameless headstones, the old trees standing quiet watch, the worn wooden benches no one remembered sitting on, But today, something had shifted. Not the ground, but the air. Not the sound, but the sense. As if he had returned something important to a place long forgotten. As if the reason for existing wasn't about permanence, but about being a place where one man remembered who he was. At the parking lot, Elijah paused for a second, turning to look back at the hilltop where Evelyn's headstone leaned gently in the afternoon light. Not a goodbye, he thought, a return. That evening, Eliza recounted everything to Michael at a small cafe downtown, the same place where they had first discussed their opening lawsuit against Oakwood System. "He didn't go to say farewell," Eliza said, her eyes on the rain-speckled window. "He went to confirm he's still on the right path." Michael nodded. Silent, he looked down at his phone where hundreds of messages, calls, and emails from small communities were flooding in. Every name was a silence being undone. And right there in Oakwood, the place once defined by quiet, voices were rising. No spokesperson, no broadcast, just people who once didn't dare speak, now realizing they're not alone, because someone from a windswept hill had written a promise on behalf of them all. 6 months after his final testimony before Congress, Elijah Freeman was no longer seen on television. He didn't attend legal conferences, write op-eds, or accept offers from prestigious magazines eager to profile the man who made the system look at itself. When asked, he simply replied, "I've spoken enough for others to hear. Now it's time I do the rest for those who were never given the chance to speak." And that rest began quietly on a calm April morning in a small conference room in Atlanta, where Elijah officially launched the Freeman Legal Equity Trust, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal support to individuals who were wrongfully detained, administratively entrapped, or had their civil complaints quietly erased from public systems. There were no glamorous backdrops, no celebrities, no performances, just a long wooden table draped in a white cloth, a single microphone, and about 20 people seated in a circle. Among them were Eliza, Michael, the colleagues who had stood by Elijah throughout the Oakwood investigation, and a few young faces from other states who had come to volunteer. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to begin. The fund was launched through modest donations from the community, a handful of independent civil organizations, and most notably, through the Civil Freedom Medal funds Elijah had once declined. After the government failed to present the medal, they offered to transfer the full amount as seed capital for the trust to honor personal choice while preserving collective value. Elijah agreed on one condition. His name would not be etched onto the donor plaque. "I can sign the papers," he said, "but don't carve anything unfinished." When invited to speak at the launch, Elijah took the mic without notes. He didn't open with eloquence, nor did he retell the story everyone already knew. He simply looked around the room and said, "I didn't start this fund because I won. I started it because too many people aren't allowed to lose, but still get forced to." Then he stepped away from the mic and sat down, as if he'd never stood. No loud applause, just quiet glances exchanged between those present, like witnessing a cornerstone being laid, a time marker, a structural step forward, and from that point they began dividing the work. Eliza became the trust's first executive director. Michael led the legal team, organizing a network of independent attorneys who had once operated in isolation but now had a common base. In the first month alone, the Freeman Trust received 72 requests for assistance from 11 states. Most had a similar pattern: people of color or members of minority communities arrested without warrants, denied access to legal counsel in the first 48 hours, or whose internal complaints had vanished within 3 days. Eliza opened the digital map, marked the high-risk zones, and began outlining clusters of systemic exposure. They weren't just handling cases, they were redrawing how the system had learned to exclude without leaving fingerprints. The Trust's logo was unveiled shortly after. Not a scale of justice, not Elijah's face, no flag or American emblem, just the image of a small child's hand holding a pen. No slogans, no branding polish, just a quiet reminder. Everyone deserves to write their own story, truthfully. Elijah had no part in designing it, but when he saw it, he nodded gently. Yes, he said. "We don't need to hold the scale. We need to hold the pen and be allowed to use it." And so the name Freeman remained, not on a judge's bench, but on the door of a small office built to stand in the space the system kept leaving behind. No one called it glory. They called it commitment. And that was exactly what Elijah intended to keep, like the part of him that would never leave. Since the Freeman Trust began operations, the small second-floor office in Atlanta's West End stayed lit late into the night. There was no glowing sign outside, no front desk reception, but people found their way there through word of mouth, through tearful phone calls, and sometimes by sliding a note under the door that simply read, "I need help. I was arrested for something I didn't do." Eliza worked there nearly every day. She didn't need to pitch or fundraise. People came because they knew this place didn't promise victory. It only promised not to leave anyone behind in silence. Michael led the legal team, not like a manager, but like an older brother to a group of young attorneys, many of whom had once been victims themselves, or children of those erased by the system. They didn't wear matching suits or name tags, but they read case files like people who knew the truth. Didn't live in the headlines, it lived in the crossed out lines. In just the first 3 months, they handled nearly 200 complaints from 18 states. A third involved detention record manipulation. The rest were administrative traps, from home seizures to custody terminations. One case in Arkansas, one in Indiana, 6 in Georgia. It all started the same. The victim had no one to call. Now they did. Elijah no longer appeared in public. He didn't attend press briefings, avoided media interviews, and only showed up in court when absolutely necessary. But his office, tucked behind the main hallway of the trust, had someone knock every morning with case updates. He read every file, marked key points in red, and often scribbled a question in the margins. Ask again, have they ever filed before? Or, this wording feels forced. Who wrote this for them? Those small notes were treated as strategic flags by the legal team, because even without the gavel, Elijah was still the one who could read the first crack in what looked like an impenetrable wall. One night in July, an independent news outlet aired a short documentary segment about the Freeman Trust. The journalist said, "No one mentions Elijah Freeman every day anymore, but in places where silence lingers, people are starting to wonder, am I living in another version of Oakwood?" The clip showed Eliza answering phones, Michael reviewing case files with his team, and a young girl helping her mother fill out a form beneath the trust's logo. A child's hand holding a pen. It had no production polish, but after it aired, case submissions doubled. Not because people expected to win, but because they started to believe they weren't wrong for speaking up. In the back room, Elijah looked out the window, where the city towers had dimmed, but the office lights stayed on. He knew that light wasn't from spotlights. It didn't come from awards, fame, or press. It came from the handwriting of each case at night, from the ones knocking, knowing someone would answer, from the formerly silent, now learning to speak again, in their own voice. And so, Elijah stepped back, not with a farewell speech, but with a quiet legacy. No bronze statue, no grand send-off, just a small organization bearing his name. Not to honor him, but to remind the system there was once a man who lived inside it, was nearly swallowed by it, but chose to step out, to keep even a flicker of light from being extinguished forever. The story of Elijah Freeman is not merely the journey of one man reclaiming a voice that was stolen. It's a mirror reflecting something far larger in our society: prejudice, the abuse of power, and a systematized silence. From what seemed like an ordinary roadside stop, Elijah, a justice of the United States Supreme Court, was dragged from his car not because he did anything wrong, but because of the color of his skin and the silence the system assumed he would maintain. But his response wasn't driven by rage. It was shaped by intellect, persistence, and a commitment never to back down in the face of injustice. The greatest lesson here is this: don't judge others through the lens of prejudice. When you see someone, elderly, a person of color, simply dressed, you have no idea they might be the very person who helped write the laws governing the nation. Talent, worth, and dignity are not printed on name tags or academic titles. They're revealed in how someone confronts injustice, and justice, even when blocked, distorted, or delayed, always finds a way, so long as there are enough people who refuse to bow their heads. From one personal experience, Elijah reignited a nationwide dialogue about civil rights, transparency, and systemic accountability. But more importantly, he refused to let that moment define him as a permanent victim. Instead, he transformed it into the foundation for the Freeman Foundation, to ensure others would never have to endure what he once did alone. That is not merely the act of a judge. It is the action of a citizen who understands that justice isn't something handed down. It's something we must all help preserve. Have you ever been judged unfairly by someone who didn't know your story? Have you ever been dismissed or excluded, only to quietly prove you were stronger than they ever imagined? If this story resonates with you, share it. Let others draw the lesson. Silence should never become the norm. Stand for the truth, not just when you are hurt, but especially when someone else needs your voice. And if you want to continue following real stories of justice, courage, and belief in human dignity, don't forget to subscribe, because the most important stories often aren't found in headlines. They live in how we choose to tell them and how we carry them forward together.